Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our forward-looking panel on investing and accelerating to net zero. This panel is part of BAB's Corporate Citizenship and Sustainability series, which covers critical ESG issues in business and private sector-led initiatives. A series which is made possible thanks to our partners and sponsors, Debevoise and Plimpton, and EY. We really do have a superstar panel today, purposefully curated to provide a diversity of perspective from three leading industries. Before we welcome our fantastic panelists, just a few logistics for the next hour. We will kick off with a moderated discussion for about 35 minutes with our guest speakers. And then for the remainder of the time, we will open up the discussion to questions from you, the audience. We ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute if you're not speaking, but please do keep your cameras on. We like this to be interactive. If and when you do have a question, please let us know, let the moderator know by using the raise your hand feature, and we will come to you so that you can ask your question live. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Kimberly Henderson, who is a partner in McKinsey's Washington, D.C. office. Geographically, Kimberly has worked in McKinsey's Chicago, London, and Sao Paulo offices. She serves investors, nonprofits, energy and industrial players, and policymakers with her expertise in sustainability and climate-related challenges. She focuses on supporting organizations as they navigate the transition to a zero carbon economy. Some examples of Kimberly's recent projects include—
Tom, I think we can go to the speakers rather than, I think that's enough about—
Oh, sorry, Kimberly. Well, in that case, over to you.
Great, thank you. No, I want to spend most of the time hearing from our speakers today, because as Tamara mentioned, we do have a wonderful lineup. So I think we've got three very complementary perspectives here to talk about how we accelerate this net zero transition. So first of all, we've got Rudy Winter, president at National Grid, which is a business that provides power and natural gas to 4 million customers across New York State. So he has deep expertise on what this transition takes for the energy system. And then secondly, Kevin Garrow here. He's managing director, head of Americas at Standard Chartered Bank. So he heads their natural and renewable resources and has a very good view of what this takes from a capital deployment perspective. And then third, Kirsty McIntyre. So Kirsty is the Global Sustainability Director for Diageo. You can see her in the Tanqueray room there. And she has a fantastic background on sustainability, from Diageo and from the electronics industry, and has published widely on the topic. So we're very pleased with this group today, because I think they'll do a fantastic job of taking everyone through what this takes. I'll let them each share a little more about themselves as we get going. But Rudy, why don't you start? Share anything more on your background, and then I'd love your perspective of what the transition takes technically, for the energy system. Just the framing for this.
Got it. Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks for inviting me to today's panel. As mentioned, I'm Rudy Winter. I'm president of National Grid New York. I think you're all familiar with National Grid, and I run our New York business. I've been in the energy sector for about 33 years. Right now, running National Grid New York means that I run a utility in upstate New York that's predominantly electricity transmission, electricity distribution, and gas distribution, and in downstate, a gas distribution business. All of these businesses are going through a tremendous change as we think about the energy transition. And energy is going to play a key role as we talk about the clean energy future and mitigating climate change going forward. I think energy is on all of our minds as we look at the geopolitical impacts on energy prices. We see electrification taking place all around us as we look to convert some of our cars to electric vehicles. And we see the growing trend of moving away from fossil fuels, moving towards renewables. So all of these things play a key role in that energy transition. At National Grid, and one of the things I do in our New York business is think about and execute on plans for how do we make sure that our networks, because at our core, we provide services to customers through our networks. How do we make sure our networks are an enabler for state policy, for federal policies to enable that clean energy transition and not an inhibitor? And Kimberly, that is challenging because in the energy space, there's something called the energy trilemma that we always try to balance, right? And that trilemma is reliability, it's sustainability, and it's affordability. And we deploy capital and we put time and energy on all of those and we try to balance. And you could see if you focus on one too hard, focus on reliability, I can make sure the network is absolutely reliable, but it would be something that maybe no one could afford. Or we'd be looking at fossil fuels for baseload generation and it's not sustainable. So you have to strike that balance, and that's where the challenge comes in. Energy systems and energy networks, to transition them take decades. I always remind people, we talk about an energy transition, and it is just that. It is a transition. It is not a simple sort of flipping of the switch. So balancing that energy trilemma is number one, and that's where a lot of the stresses come out when you're trying to balance that. The second thing I would say is the role that federal support plays. Federal support, federal regulation plays a big role in making sure that we have some consistency in policies. When we have consistent policies, then we could attract capital and make some of the transition occur. These are asset-intensive businesses and will require a lot of capital and construction to change them out. So federal support plays a key role, and I could talk about that a little bit later on, as we see playing out with offshore wind leases here in New York as we transition New York's energy portfolio. The next big piece in making all this happen is, how does technology play a role? And very often I'm asked, what do you think of solar? What do you think of batteries? And, it's not one answer. There is no silver bullet. We will need a lot of technologies that we can bring onto the grid today. But quite frankly, we're going to need some additional innovation if we want to hit our aggressive climate mitigation goals into the future. So technology is going to play a critical role as we look for technology to help us optimize the grid, and technology to also just bring new clean energy resources onto the grid. And then finally, I would say, as we think about the energy transition, we want to make sure that no one gets left behind. We've seen other transitions occur, and we've seen either certain communities or certain people in certain socioeconomic status classes get left behind. I mean, we're still talking about getting broadband to some people, and it's 2022, for goodness sake. So we want to make sure no one gets left behind. So when we are thinking about this energy transition, yes, we're thinking about the capital that we need and how do we build out the transmission networks and gas networks for the future. But we also think about the communities and how do we make sure these solutions are affordable, but how do we also make sure that all communities are getting the training that they need to get positioned for those jobs in that energy sector in the future. So a lot of our responsible business charter and our ESG focus is on doing just that. So I'll leave it there as those big sort of pillars of which we can dig into a little bit later on.
Thanks, Rudy. I think your last topic of environmental justice is a really top of mind issue today. And you touched on a few aspects of that, the affordability question, green jobs. Kevin, I know you have perhaps a more global perspective of the just transition, including for emerging markets. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, of how do we make this a just transition? But maybe before you start, Kevin, maybe just give a little bit more of your background from Standard Chartered. And you're on mute, Kevin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Kimberly. And firstly, a big thanks to Tamara and Emma and the British American business for setting this up, which is a very important topic and very much the challenge of our time. So yeah, my name is Kevin Garrow, and I run the natural and renewable resources team here at Standard Chartered Bank in the Americas. My background, I've been with the bank for 14 years, grew up in South Africa farming community, and the primary industries in that community were very much farming and mining. So it was almost a juxtaposition around, the agribusiness part as well as the mining part, and that's kind of where I a lot of my formative years spent working there, during college, and I kind of grew a love for these sectors. And our natural and renewable resources group covers the agribusiness piece, as well as our erstwhile oil and gas business, our metals and mining business, and the growing renewables business. I think our belief is that while climate change, does not respect borders, its impacts will be felt, much more keenly in the developing world. And given our unique footprint at Standard Chartered, we are present in 58 markets, primarily focused in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We have prioritized, some of the deployment of our resources and our client relationships to support this just transition. I have seen, estimates that roughly a billion people across the world today do not have access to electricity. And we've also seen estimates that between 2040 and 2050, the world population will likely grow by 2 billion people. That population growth will not be, here in North America or in Europe. Most of that growth will come from across Asia and Africa. So we have a big problem. The demand for energy is growing, and we have a transition in a way that leaves, we have to transition in a way that leaves no one behind. So I guess, to answer the question, what does a global just transition require? It's going to require investment and time. And unfortunately, I think we're probably sorely lacking in, in kind of both of those. I think we're running out of time. We recognize that transition, as the previous speaker had mentioned, it's going to take a number of decades to get there. But we obviously have the concern around climate. Here at Standard Chartered, we are focused on many of the world's largest multinational clients. We also have, we also bank many of the world's largest institutional investors. And it's going to be our work with these clients, in terms of their investments into, our emerging markets, specifically around renewable investments. So getting this investment is going to be crucial. We also recognize that there's a fairly substantial material gap in the investment around energy transition. So we will naturally work hard with our clients to focus on, building out investments, building out the thesis, and executing in terms of various projects that are going to be supporting the energy transition, specifically around renewables and new technologies. But we can get to those later. That's very much just an introduction.
Thanks, Kevin. I'd love Kirsty maybe to speak to some of these decarbonization projects underway, at least from the Diageo perspective, which I know is a global company, and you operate in many markets. So maybe Kirsty, if you could share a little more about yourself, and then any insights for the group on how Diageo is executing on decarbonization and how that's going.
Of course, and thanks very much, Kimberly. So very nice to meet you all. I work for Diageo. We own over 200 alcohol and non-alcohol brands, which we sell across the world. Tanqueray, as you see behind me, being one of them. We also have Johnny Walker, Gordon's, Guinness, Bailey's, Captain Morgan's, Bulleit, Crown Royal, Smirnoff. I could just keep going, but those are some of the big ones. So we have what we call our global giants, which you will see everywhere in every market. And then we also have some local hero brands as well. So for example, we're one of the largest producers of whiskies in India, for example. And then we have other local brands in Latin America and Asia Pacific as well. So in terms of those decarbonization, and my background really is I joined Diageo in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. Took me over a year before I met my boss face to face. I hired a big team, most of whom I didn't meet until this year. So it's been quite an interesting transition for myself on a personal level. I also transitioned not just only from that pandemic space into now the real world. It's very nice to be back in the office, and especially in such lovely meeting rooms as this. But also I transitioned from over 20 years in the electronics sector into a very different CPG business. It's been very interesting that actually the application of sustainability works in both. I'm constantly surprised about how similar my conversations are in both places, how similar the challenges are, and the work that we have to get through this transition. So I think, where I tend to look at this from a big picture is that we have a need for systemic change and we have to do it using systems thinking. And both of the previous speakers have talked about that. You can't look at one aspect of sustainability by itself. You have to look at all of it together. It does make it super complicated, but that's what we need to do. And so, for example, at Diageo, we know we can't separate climate change from other issues such as water stress, biodiversity loss, poverty and inequality. And we also can't separate climate mitigation from climate adaptation. You have to do both. And so that systemic change that we have to get to reach net zero means that we need to collaborate across business, government, and our supply chains. And it's a challenge and an opportunity to work differently with different people. And, you know, one of the quotes I love to use in this is from Henry Ford, of all people, you know, the founder of the Ford Motor Car Company. And he said, if you do what you always did, you will get what you always got. And clearly we are an inflection point where we need to get different stuff. And so therefore we've got to do it in a different way. So in terms of some of the things that we're doing in a different way on these big decarbonisation projects, as you mentioned, Kimberly, we opened our first carbon neutral distillery in Lebanon, Kentucky this fiscal year. Bullet bourbon is distilled there using electrode boilers that we powered by 100% renewable electricity. We saw some mix of wind and solar. So that goes back to Rudy's point, is that you need to have lots of different technologies coming in. Just making a choice to move to electric over gas or a heavy fuel oil for us, you know, it means that we need to be working with local municipalities and authorities and the grid to be able to source that energy. And it's very much a handshake type of agreement as we move through. And so that, for example, will avoid more than 117,000 tons of metric tons of carbon emissions each year, huge amount, and is the equivalent of taking 25,000 cars off the road. It's a huge thing, but we need to be delivering one of those types of projects every single year through our decade of action to 2030. At Diageo, we have a goal of being net zero in our direct emissions. So that's all of our direct operations worldwide. I have 150 sites to get through what Lebanon has done already. And I have a roadmap. Exactly as Rudy says, what we're bringing in is existing technology. And then we also need new and novel technologies to come through for us. What my doubt is, and I think it would be a good topic of conversation, is when those will arrive. When can we wait for them? Because the other thing that we've learned within our decarbonisation at Diageo so far in the first 2 years, since we announced our net zero goal in 2020, is that these big decarbonisation projects take time. So on average, from making the decision and agreeing the funding, we are finding it's 18 to 36 months before I see a decarbonisation benefit flowing through. So, for example, at COP26 last year in Glasgow in Scotland, we made an announcement with the Quebec government that we will move our large Canadian, that's the Crown Royal distilleries at Valleyfield in Quebec, over to hydropower. That requires the Quebec government to build a hydroelectric dam. It requires us to put in electrode boilers, and we have to bring in the power lines. As Rudy will know extremely well, there's a very large power line. It has to come over a railway line. And so just the power line itself, for example, will cost $10 million. So these are large scale projects. They take a long time. We announced it at COP26. I'm not expecting to see decarbonisation from that project on that distillery until probably 2025, 2026. And so you have to start now. There is no time to wait around this. And even if we don't know what the end of the decade or even the next decade is going to look like, you've got to make a plan and you've got to start work, because we have found out it takes a lot of time to get the arrangements together, to encourage people to build the infrastructure, to clear out some of the roadblocks in the way through policy and government, and to move ourselves forward. So I'll stop there, but we have lots more examples to talk about if you want them.
Thanks, Kirsty. Actually, that is a very important topic, this point that we have to start now, because, you know, just for the audience's context, if society wants to be on a 1.5 degree pathway, that means a 50% emissions reduction by 2030. So that is a really short timeline for these changes. And Rudy, I might come back to you kind of for the reality check of what's possible, how fast can we go? You know, and Kirsty mentioned renewables, but you also mentioned offshore wind, which is even harder, and then hydrogen, of course, you know, for certain applications. So what do you see as the best case scenario for the timeline here?
So I always say to folks, you know, we can't let, I always mess up this expression, you can't let perfect be the enemy of good, or, you know, whatever, however that plays out. But I think we have to move forward, and we have to move forward, and we see states like New York, Massachusetts, California being aggressive, moving forward, and trying some things. All of these things, as we've heard before, take time, but they also take a lot of money. I mean, when you talk about the electric grid, Kimberly, just some research I saw from McKinsey and Company, if you look at what the United States spent across the US on the electricity distribution and transmission networks, we probably spent about $150 billion last year. If we're on a pathway to 1.5C, we have to build out and change things on those networks to incorporate and integrate all of these renewables, right? You really have to look at spending on the orders of magnitude of almost double, almost $300 billion by the year 2030. So all of that construction takes time. No matter what you're building, there's always permitting issues, siting issues. Communities potentially don't want to see offshore wind and things like that. So number one, we have to get moving. Number two, we have to do a lot in this country, a lot of outreach around what it's truly going to take and what the costs are. And then number three, there is a big role for the federal government to play, and I see them leaning in and playing it. As I mentioned before, one thing is just regulatory certainty. That attracts capital so that we can do the construction like we just heard about. We can bring in new technologies. The second is we see the federal government leading in on doing leases so you can build offshore wind in federal lands off the coast. Just a few months ago, there were 6 land leases that went for about $4.4 billion here in New York. We bid and won one of those as well, and we're going to be building an offshore wind farm off of New York. But then probably most importantly, as you take a look at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, that's a $1.2 trillion bill that's focused on infrastructure across the US, and that infrastructure goes from railroads to ports to highways, but also to water and energy systems. So there's probably about $200 billion there that the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation are going to deploy, looking at specifically projects that can accelerate our transition. And not just new renewables projects, but they're going to be looking for projects on weatherization and energy efficiency for buildings, looking for projects for resiliency and reducing outages, so making sure our networks are resilient, and then looking for examples of hydrogen hubs as well. We think that green hydrogen will play a role in the net zero future as a clean burning fuel that we could put through to operate power plants that currently use natural gas, or put in our networks and displace some natural gas. But those hydrogen hubs are usually going to be things that we are going to see take place in different regions around the country. The federal government is actively looking for New York and some other big states to host these hydrogen hubs. So I think we have to start deploying capital now. We've got to start doing the engineering and planning for these things now so the construction can begin. And there's a long tail on these various construction projects. But I guess my broader point is, we are on a pathway to 1.5C. There are challenges around doing that, but I'm an optimist, and I do believe that we do need some more innovation, but we can't sort of get locked into thinking that it's going to be easy.
Yeah, indeed. I think this conversation is making very clear for folks, this is a tough transition. Kevin, I wanted to get your thoughts on the role of the financial sector, because we've seen in the last couple of years, financial institutions of different types really mobilizing on climate action, both setting their own net zero targets and deploying capital, to fund this transition. So I'd love to hear any more from you about the role of finance.
So I think, in terms of, financial institutions and specifically here at Standard Chartered, we have developed our own net zero pathway, in consultation with the Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTI, as well as the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which has been subjected to review and scrutiny by our board. We have entered into ongoing and structured programs of engagement with key stakeholders, including our shareholders, as well as NGOs, and these have been very proactive, and they have formed kind of our thinking and basis in terms of our own, decarbonization targets. Our group management team continues to retain the responsibility for this pathway, as demonstrated in terms of the inclusion and the measurements around group scorecards and long-term incentive plans. And this will be overseen and continue to be overseen by our board. We will be reporting our progress around these targets through the TCFD. And over the course of 2022, we will aim to develop capabilities to report externally on a quarterly basis against these, these key targets. So just in terms, to give you an idea, obviously we have our own emissions from our operations, and we have committed to becoming net zero by 2025, and that encompasses the the residual scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this will include work that we're doing around our commercial real estate footprint, our global travel, and how we will mitigate the carbon footprint there, as well as work around our infrastructure, which includes technology. Secondly, in terms of our suppliers, we ensure that we have them sign our supplier charter. We will progressively measure and manage and reduce the emissions that arise from our procurement in terms of these commitments. But most importantly, I think our commitments around kind of term them the scope 3 emissions, and those are the financed emissions from our clients. Our goal is to accelerate sustainable finance, supporting and helping them build out resilient physical, in terms of the physical climate risk mitigation. Our ability to do this is significant given the expertise that we have internally in facilitating finance and in the locations that are most vulnerable, right? So our emerging markets. And these markets are probably least prepared for these risks. We have a dedicated sustainable finance team, which drives and coordinates these efforts across the bank. And we will continue to measure and reduce these emissions, through the associated financing of our clients in alignment with these net zero objectives by 2050. We also have position statements and prohibitive, activities lists. This provides us a framework and defines activities in terms of what we will finance and what we won't through the energy transition. Then we also have specific targets around 2030 in terms of the heavy carbon sectors, right? So the likes of oil and gas, metals and mining and power. We aim to reduce our financed emissions on these sectors by 2030 by 30%. That gives you a bit of an idea in terms of what we'll be doing. I think I absolutely concur with the prior speakers with regards to there has to be more of a collaborative effort. I think definitely collaboration between the public and private sector, and we will certainly mobilize our clients in terms of that collaboration. We are working with our large multinational clients around new technologies, assisting them in financing, specifically around our build out of our renewables portfolio. And that portfolio, includes both wind, solar, carbon capture, battery storage, as well as, the green hydrogen space that we've been speaking about.
Thanks, Kevin. You mentioned scope 3, which for the audience, scope 3 is upstream or downstream emissions that's not directly controlled by the company. For financial institutions, that includes everything they finance. So it's a bit of a special definition. Yeah. But for a company like Diageo, that would be your supply chain largely. And Kirsty, I know you mentioned suppliers before. I know this is one of your areas of expertise. I'd love to hear anything about how is it going working with suppliers? We're seeing this as McKinsey across industries now, companies really mobilizing to work with their suppliers to take down emissions. So I just wanted to hear any more on that from you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So all of the challenges that I talked about within direct operations and reducing emissions from direct operations equally apply to our suppliers, because their scopes 1 and 2 are our scope 3. At Diageo, we have 31,000 suppliers worldwide who range from very large companies, companies who are bigger than us, all the way through to smallholder farmers who are just growing one crop, and we buy the entire crop and we use it to make our products. So to give you an idea of the scale within this, so our scope 1 and 2 products, our scope 1 and 2 emissions account for 10% of our total carbon footprint at Diageo. Scope 3 is 90%, and that's very normal for a company like us, for a CPG company. And even with a bank, you would expect it to be very large. The scope 3 would be much larger. So our total carbon footprint is 5.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And so you can see where all of that work is. So that basically that 5 million tons, that sits within that 31,000 suppliers that we have to address. So the opportunity for collaboration, the opportunity to share best practice, which is really what we're looking to do, is enormous. And when we're pushing for decarbonisation, when we're pushing for renewables, we're doing the same thing for the high carbon parts of our supply chain, which is glass manufacturing, which is aluminium can manufacturing, and then also within our agricultural sector. So about half of our scope 3, I said that was 90%, about half of that is in packaging and about half of that is in agricultural inputs. We need to be able to work very differently with those different groups of people. You know, they behave extremely differently. They are different types of suppliers. And so it requires a lot of agility and flexibility and that connection, that ability to talk to all sorts of different types of people, to set targets and to get everybody on the journey. So that's what we want to be doing here. So, you know, it's really only when we all come together that we're going to make a difference, because climate change really is a global goal, and we want to be able to support our suppliers to be able to get there. So some of the examples that I give in there. So what we've got is some, Rudy mentioned hydrogen. So we're working to create hydrogen hubs here in the UK at the moment, and we're early investors in that with some of our packaging manufacturers, and then also other industries who need to access that hydrogen. We have an advantage here in the UK. We're an island, which means that offshore wind is not such a challenge as it is for us that it is in the US. We have a lot of coastline compared to our landmass. And so that's one way of making that green hydrogen. And then what you need to be able to do is be able to set up those hubs that will be able to use that hydrogen when it comes on. And so again, being forward thinking about our investment, as Kevin was talking about, we are making these very early investments, knowing that we won't be using that hydrogen probably before well, I certainly don't think we'll be using it before 2030. So this requires long-term planning and execution with our supply chain as we move forward, and the ability to really manage that complexity through that supply chain and bring everybody with us on the journey.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. So I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to get questions from the audience. So I encourage people to either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Kevin, I might draw on you first, because there was one around the role of oil and gas services in enabling the transition. And I think in general, there's a lot of discussion right now about brown to green and how do you transition different industries, you know, including some of the fossil fuel sector.
Yeah.
And so if any more color on how Standard Chartered approaches this topic and what you consider prohibited versus what you try to help transition.
Certainly. I think, you know, a case in point right now is something stemming from the current geopolitical situation, you know, in Europe, right? I think we have this situation playing out around, you know, energy security and Russian gas as it has played its way into Europe. You know, there has been a somewhat murky view or a fuzzy view around LNG. I think we recognize, you know, LNG is a fossil fuel and a carbon emitter. However, LNG has now been included in the EU taxonomy up until 2030, I think, and there are a number of US LNG export plants that are busy building out in terms of that export of LNG into initially into Asia to displace coal, but currently are being diverted, you know, into Europe to replace Russian gas. And that's an area where we, as a bank, we've been doing a lot of due diligence around it, going through a number of assessments with regards to LNG, and we recognize it is a short-term situation. I think ultimately the longer-term view of the bank is clearly we'll be pushing harder into the renewables sector. We are certainly urging and advising some of our clients who are making their own investments, who are forming their own platforms, lower carbon platforms. These platforms are becoming more and more material. But, as I think we've spoken about, Kirsty's mentioned it, Rudy's mentioned it, I think the situation is, or the challenge is time. I think, Europe needs energy now. Winter is only a few months away. I think we recognize that there is a short-term view that we are looking at as a bank, but there is certainly a medium-term, longer-term view that we will be consulting and advising our clients in terms of their own progress in the renewable space, the lower carbon space, and in the gas space as it displaces many of our emerging markets, energy makeups, specifically around coal. Because coal has become, amongst not just us, but many of our banking peers, a no-go zone. We will no longer finance thermal coal plants or any new builds in the future. So LNG is certainly a mechanism in terms of replacing that in the lower format, but our focus will certainly be on building out the renewables portfolio and our clients as they invest in those markets.
Kevin, you mentioned the Ukraine crisis, and I'd love to get thoughts from any of our speakers on the impact there, because I think people often ask, is this going to slow down the transition, that we're now just focused on energy security, whatever the emissions, or will it speed up the transition? And so if any of our speakers have a perspective on that, I'd love to hear it.
I have a perspective. I think I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think I think the transition will potentially speed up as a result. Europe naturally has to diversify away from its current sources, and I think it's very clear that there will be a push towards building out renewables in a more rapid flow and basis. So I think our view is that the energy security crisis has actually accelerated the push around transition.
Rudy?
Kimberly, yeah, I would say that the security crisis has brought to, I think, the public forum and the public debate that trilemma that I talked about before. How do you trade off security of supply or reliability against sustainability, and then finally affordability? And I think that debate is actively playing out. I think it's important for that debate to play out so we come up with the right solutions that are also affordable solutions. Germany has to think about reliability this winter. So today they are putting natural gas, they're buying in storage, and they're starting up their coal power plants, right? So do they want to do that? No, they don't, but they have to answer the reliability question as they answer that trilemma. So I think it's important that the world and the United States have that ongoing debate so we come up with the right solutions that get us to sustainability in an affordable manner. I think that is going to mean that fossil fuels are going to play a role. Fossil fuels and also blending green hydrogen into natural gas networks to decarbonize those are also going to play a role. So you could answer the affordability question while you maintain reliability and you provide a clean burning fuel.
Yeah, I agree with what both of the speakers have said. It's interesting. I'm in Amsterdam this week. It's only 1,400 miles away, the Ukraine conflict. It's close. And I think that's part of the shock of the system as well. And I think this is also, there is clearly, I'll go back to what I started, there is clearly a need for systemic change. And this is one of the shocks that is along the way to that systemic change. And that's not to diminish the appalling of what is happening in the Ukraine. And so, I think that if I look at it from a slightly different angle than carbon, so for example, we make a lot of our products from the same grains that come from Ukraine. We weren't buying a lot from Ukraine, but we do use wheat and corn and barley and other grain products to make our. Now, that Ukraine conflict is now creating food shortages in various parts of the world. And what we tend to look at, if I think about it, is then, and this is why you require the systems thinking. You have to do this in a very coordinated and connected type of way. The question we ask ourselves at Diageo is, how long is it going to be ethical to make an alcohol product from a food substance when there are food shortages? We have the same question that we ask ourselves very much about making. You cannot make a drink without water. All of the tequila that is made in the world has to come, because it's not called tequila otherwise, it has to come from 5 regions of Jalisco in Mexico. Otherwise, it's not called tequila. It's a geographically indicated product. Every single one of those regions is water stressed. So we make that product in Jalisco, and we then ship that product, which contains water, from Jalisco to other parts of the world. And we question ourselves very carefully about how long will that be considered to be an ethical thing. If the communities there are short of water and the farmers can't use it to grow their own crops, or people don't have it to drink or to wash with. And these are really serious questions for companies to ask when they think about climate resilience and climate adaptation. And so I think that the Ukraine conflict is a step along the way to much larger systemic change. And it brings some of these big questions into sharp focus for us. And we mustn't shy away from looking at them carefully and looking at them very seriously.
Thanks, Kirsty. That's a great example of how some of these multiple ESG factors can come together. Kevin, I saw you went off mute. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to, just again, in terms of Kirsty's comment, I think similarly, I think from an ethical standpoint, I think we all are, I think across the board, asking questions around, the biofuel concept or the biofuel complex, which obviously includes, a lot of, oil seeds and grains that are feedstock for our biofuels. There's certainly a question mark that's been asked. Questions are being asked, around that food versus fuel debate. And then the other point, I was going to highlight was, I know we were looking at the energy transition, but I think we can't look at things in isolation, specifically around, a market like Russia and Ukraine with regards to fertilizer production, and how this is also played out. Because I think there are a number of stresses across the world in terms of many of our commodity markets, but clearly fertilizer production is also one of concern and playing out in terms of the inflationary situation that we're seeing, not just fuel prices that are high. So a lot of interesting stuff that's happening.
Yeah, Ukraine, I believe between Russia and Ukraine, they also supply over 20% of the world's nickel for batteries. So there's another potential impact that we could see down the road. So Kirsty, you talked about a lot of different sustainability, and social and ethical topics that kind of interlink. One of them that I imagine is very top of mind for consumer goods is circular economy, which we've seen significant progress on that topic in Europe in recent years. And I think in the US, starting to see more momentum. I'd love any thoughts on how the circular economy interplays with some of these other challenges and how you think about that from the Diageo perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because it really, I think I've spent most of today talking about it, so it's very top of mind for us. So when I mentioned before about scope 3 emissions, and what we predominantly talked about there was in decarbonizing the activities of our packaging manufacturers, for example, or of the farming that goes on. So that's a part of it, the decarbonization of packaging manufacturing. Of course, the other way to decarbonize within that scope 3 is to use less packaging. And that's where circular solutions come in, is how do we do more with less? How do we get our products to customers using less packaging? How do we get consumers to stop thinking about single-use bottles? So when you buy that beautiful bottle of whiskey, when you buy that beautiful bottle of gin and you have a nice party at the weekend or whatever it is, how do we get you to return that bottle to us so we can refill it? Are you prepared, for example, to have that bottle and receive a refill pouch, perhaps through the post if your country allows that to happen, so that we can send it to you and you keep that bottle as a beautiful decanter bottle to display in your home or in your bar, if you're a business, and what we send you is a refill solution to that. And we're doing all sorts of trials all over the world around different types of refill models, again, to work out how do we continue to get product to customers and use considerably less packaging in that process. This is, again, comes back to that systemic change. We need consumers to come on this journey with us. Particularly in the industry that I work in, we've done an excellent job of persuading consumers that premium spirits come in beautiful, heavy glass bottles. We have to now change that and challenge that perception, that what it means to buy a beautiful bottle of premium spirit means that you get a heavy glass bottle with it. And how do we then take consumers on that journey with us and engage them into that activity with us? We need people to be part of that process and that systemic change with us. I'll finish by giving you a more sort of B2B example in there, which I think speaks beautifully to this sort of British-American collaboration and how we work together. So Bullet, who I mentioned before, has completed, they've planted over 1 million white oak trees in the US in the last few years. White oak is very important to us because it's what we make our bourbon casks out of, that we mature our bourbon in. When that cask has finished maturing the bourbon over 3 years plus, we don't throw it away. We then send it across to the UK, to Scotland, and we use those bourbon casks to then mature our whiskey and to give our whiskey different types of flavors. And so those casks then go on. They can have up to 100 years of life, those casks, and could go round that circle and be refurbished up to 7 times. And I think that's another example of circularity within this. So there's one example of circularity, which is all about consumers and how we interact with consumers with our packaging and those packaging systems. I think then there's also that very nice B2B example where we're connecting the planting of trees and the connection with biodiversity and water preservation all the way through to the how we use those casks within our businesses and how long they last. So there we go. I hope that answered your question, Kimberly.
It does. And actually, you started to get to a point that relates to one of the questions that came through in the chat around examples of bringing communities along. And I think this, I think the question was originally at Rudy in terms of local communities and how you bring them along with this transition and resiliency. But obviously, personally, from your business too, any thoughts on that are appreciated.
Do you want me to start, Kimberly?
Go for
Yeah,
it.
I saw the question in the chat around how do we, what can we do with communities? And we're doing a lot. We also look at our scope 3 emissions, meaning the greenhouse gas emissions that our customers have based on the electricity or natural gas they purchased from us. So how we reduce that over time is through energy efficiency programs, weatherization, and even demand response programs. How do we incent customers to use less of the product, especially during peak times? Because all of this, the capital we need is to meet when we have our peaks. So we have to bring consumers along, have to educate consumers around that, especially as those peaks increase as we electrify more of our economy and our society with electric vehicles, et cetera. But the question in the chat specifically asked about the local communities. What are we doing with local communities? In New York, I launched something called Project C, and Project C is our revamped and refocused community outreach program. Well, we spent $7 million in New York alone helping our communities, helping our customers. We partnered with 85 community organizations. We gave grants to 6,000 small businesses, and we continue to look for ways to make that transition more affordable for those small businesses. And as I mentioned before, we also utilize that to make sure we're training people in underprivileged neighborhoods for the workforce of the future. So as we think about that transition, we think about electrification, putting up solar panels, fixing electric vehicles, installing electric heat pumps. We've trained 400 young people in certain areas to do heat pump installation and maintenance, so they are prepared for these jobs that are coming down the road. So that's what we've done just this last year. There's a lot more that we can do, But I'll also tell you just one other spin on this, and that is this goes such a long way internally with my colleagues in the company. It's in our DNA to reach out and help communities. We have a goal this year of doing about 5,000 employee volunteer hours in New York State alone. So I think it helps put the message out there that we care about our communities, but with our employees, they see it and they can participate in it as well.
Great, thank you. Kirsty, anything to add?
Yeah, I was gonna. I think where we do a lot of our engagement really with communities is around water. I mentioned water stress before. We do operate in water stress countries, water stress regions. So we carry out every 2 to 3 years. We carry out a global water stress assessment. We completed it last year across all of our manufacturing sites. About 40% of our manufacturing sites are in water stressed areas. That's a very important place for us to really think hard about in terms of our climate resilience and the mitigation adaptation we need to go through. And then our reporting, as Kevin mentioned, around TCFD, that's also another thing that I manage for Diageo. But really that water, so what we've made a goal to do by 2030 is that we will replenish more water than we use. And there are two aspects of that. We need to get super efficient with the water that we use in our operations. And then we work on water replenishment projects, like the tree planting that I mentioned with Bullet and American White Oak. We plant trees in many places around the world. We've also completed over 30 water projects in various places around the world this financial year. And they're not just really focused on the water aspect, but also on that access to water for communities. And I think that's what's really important in our African, Indian, Latin American, Central American parts of the world that we operate in. We achieved a 40% improvement in our water use through to 2020. We're continuing on that journey. We have a goal to reduce our water consumption per drink that we make by 30% by 2030, and we're on our way to do that. And I think, it's very important that, again, it's both ethical and it's about our longevity as a company. You can't make a drink without water. Therefore, water has to be available to us. To make water available to us, we have to make water available to communities. Otherwise, we lose our license to operate. And that is extremely clear to us. So those are the types of projects that we work on.
Thanks, Kirsty. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'll have a final question for all of our speakers. But before that, I just want to recap. Some of the things we've discussed in this conversation really highlight the challenge ahead. And I think my main takeaway is just how many different interlinked challenges we have to manage at once, the system change that's required. So, Rudy spoke to the trilemma for the energy system between reliability, sustainability, and affordability. And then through the conversation, we've obviously heard about the other challenges that are interlinked related to water and circular economy and social issues like energy security, food security. And we also heard about the timeline that it takes to go from making the decisions to actually having the decarbonization happen, and that period takes years. So if we want to be on a 1.5 degree pathway, it does mean moving right now. So in the context of all of these challenges, which this is clearly very hard, I'd love to hear from each of you, what gives you optimism that we as a society can do this? Kevin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think the optimism. I think what we see is, the receptiveness from our client base. They are very eager and willing to be part of the energy transition. Most of our clients in the US have ascribed to their own targets. We are very much working with governments and countries who have not set targets, given our emerging market footprint. And there has been a very sizable receptiveness in terms of that. I think the other piece that gives me hope is the willingness of a lot of our institutional investors to put up money into certain technologies and renewable projects. We've seen a number of transactions oversubscribed. We've seen a number of commercial banks coming into deals that weren't traditionally in renewables deals. So we are certainly seeing progress. I think we also recognize we're not just going to turn off the taps on our traditional oil and gas clients. I think we have certain restrictions around what we do, but we are certainly seeing a movement by these very sizable multinationals that are going to be leading the effort as they move. We will follow them into our markets, and we will make progress in that regard.
Kirsty, what gives you optimism?
Well, I am optimistic. I'm very much a glass half full type of person anyway. One of the reasons why I'm optimistic is I believe that the human race is deeply creative and very innovative in the face of major challenges. And I think this is one of those challenges. This is our generation's version of the space race. We have to get there. We want to get there. We have a single goal. We have a focus. We will get there. And along the way, what I'm deeply hopeful for is not only will we win this final goal out, so not only will we put our version of the man on the moon, we will also create so much technology and solutions along the way that we will be able to leverage those into other places. And those are the things we don't know about yet. And the fact that this climate change challenge is coming along with a digital transformation at the same time, I think is, for me, I feel very hopeful. I don't understand it all, I'll be very clear, but I am very hopeful that the solutions will come out to us if we keep looking for them.
Great, thank you. This is our man on the moon. I love that analogy. Rudy?
Yeah, I would say three things. If the first is I'm optimistic because I see a level of public and private partnerships, and those are just accelerating. That's number one. So that makes me optimistic. Second is to Christy's point about innovation. When I see companies like mine and others, our core capabilities, one of our big core competencies is utilizing our engineering and construction capabilities to solve big problems. And we all see this as that big problem that we're pivoting hard on to solve. That makes me optimistic. And the third thing that makes me optimistic is before joining this call today, I did a new employee orientation. And whenever I want to get optimistic, I do a new employee orientation. And you hear the drive around a lot of our new colleagues here at National Grid that are joining us to help solve this problem. And you see that level of innovation, that level of problem solving, and that level of enthusiasm that's absolutely infectious. So that's a third thing that always makes me optimistic.
Thanks, Rudy. I think that's a very nice, positive point to end on. Tamara, do you want to close us out?
So thank you. Just a huge thanks to our panelists today. Such an interesting conversation that covered so much territory. So I appreciate your candidness and your optimism, frankly. So Kevin, Kirsty, Rudy, and of course, Kimberly, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thanks to our audience as well. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back in the fall with more programs in this series, which again is made possible thanks to Debevoise & Plimpton and EY. So thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.